Just the latest in a series of stories in the United States about race and policing. Dion Lassiter is standing by. He knows the story very well, national race relations expert and the executive director of the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. Chad, always good to see you here. I want to get your take on what we're seeing in Minneapolis.
Certainly. And once again, Todd, thank you for having me. As you know, you and I and CTV, we've been trending with one another since 2014. And every time I'm on this wonderful show, I'm always dismayed at the race relations that we have here in the United States. What we're seeing in Minneapolis is part of a historical trajectory that brings us to the contemporary moment of white racism and white violence and how those conversations are avoided in our democracy. We see whiteness on display. And what whiteness does is it provides an opportunity for the mob to be protected, but not those who get mobbed. We see the negating and the rendering of humanity to become a non-person and non-entity and to be dehumanized for 5.5 minutes on the video. The officer kneeled on his neck, and the officer apparently, by the video account, fundamentally and foundationally looked like he was getting enjoyment out of what he was doing.
It's interesting, too, the fact that this happened in Minnesota, which is a state perhaps people don't expect to hear this kind of thing. We follow other incidents in other states, often in the South, but Minnesota.
Well, I think one of the things for us who live here in the United States, you make a great point, but it happens in the North, it happens in the South, it happens in the Midwest, it happens in the Rust Belt. And I think the primary challenge is we have to really look at white racism, white violence, and why is it that black bodies have continually been disposable in our democracy? The mayor is absolutely right when he talks about 400 years of generational trauma. I'll go a step further and say the individuals who are in the black bodies, those of us who are African Americans, how do we continue to cope oftentimes when we're suffering from generational trauma and PTSD? And once again, this is another horrifying video, and we hear another individual screaming out, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe."
Can I ask you about the looting and the rioting and some of the arson? And we're looking at some of the aftermath footage. I mean, I've been to Minneapolis several times, and I can't believe some of the images I'm seeing too, Chad, of just the burned out buildings.
No, you're absolutely right, Todd. But I would also say that when I was in Ferguson doing some therapeutic counseling in and around that catchment area, I oftentimes say that there are two types of things that we need to look at: personhood and property. So in context, when Martin Luther King says that riots are the language of the unheard, from a therapeutic sense, where do we want people to put their anger, their aggression, when they're dealing with systemic and structural oppression and inequality, educational apartheid, environmental racism, economic injustice, the anthology of police brutality? Nor do we want them to buy into their victimization, but we never come back with a therapeutic response. Well, this is how they should cope. There are only really two ways to cope: adaptively and maladaptively. So certainly we don't want to skirt the issue of ridding individuals from personal responsibility. We don't want property destroyed. We certainly don't want personhood destroyed. But I think the narrative needs to focus on the personhood of black bodies by some officers who engage in an explicit, implicit bias, and also a white supremacist ideology where they see black males as disposable. And then they get off with impunity, and it's state sanctioned. And so the goal for me is to make sure that we frame this out where we need to make sure that individuals fundamentally understand that there are hate crimes and ethnic intimidation laws, and that there are civil remedies for this family if they trend in that direction and they're not able to get prosecution from a criminal standpoint. But you're absolutely right. The property and stuff is very important to look at, but the personhood of how we see black males as non-person, non-entity, not all officers, but a large margin of them here in the States, has got to be addressed.
And there's always this conflict that goes on, Chad. I know you're familiar, where the story began with the death of a black man, but then there's a lot of media coverage on the protests and the demonstrations and the rioting and the arson, which sometimes takes the storyline in a whole different direction. What do you think needs to happen here in this particular case? We know the mayor of Minneapolis has called for the arresting officer to actually be charged.
Well, with all due respect, Todd, my admiration for you is I wish we could take you and put you into the United States with regards to the way that you are neutral, how you are not biased. I think that what the media oftentimes does in the United States is it seduces us into that quick paradigm shift where we're focusing on the person's background. So we hear narratives that the person had a Harvard University degree. It didn't matter if the person had a GED. We also focus on the looting, but we're always looking at the things that are occurring, not what led up to it. Similar to several of the episodes that you and I have done around Colin Kaepernick taking the nail. We're not looking at the anthology of police brutality that got him to take the nail. We're looking at him as being a problem. The looters are not the problem in Minneapolis. The problem in Minneapolis is a white officer who did not see the humanity of a black individual. The result and the outpouring was the looting, was the firing, the fires and things of that nature. And we certainly need to speak to that and hold people responsible. But that is an outgrowth of the trigger of white supremacy and American democracy.
We appreciate our conversations with you, Chad, whenever we can get you on the show. Thank you so much for taking the time for us here in Canada once again today.
Thank you. And it's always good to see you, my dear friend.